Welcome to the Explore Words, Discover Worlds podcast, presented by Bradford Literature Festival. In this episode, delve into the history and legend of one of Britain's most iconic features, Boudica, the warrior queen who led the greatest rebellion the country has ever seen. Recorded live at the 2023 Bradford Literature Festival, writer, archaeologist and author Duncan Mackay discusses one of history's most fascinating and inspiring figures.
Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to see all of you out on a Saturday morning, and seeming to want to take a journey in search of the same person. I'm joined by Duncan Mackay, who is going to lead us in that journey, a journey in search of Boudica, Echo Lands, being the title of the book. So I just want to take just a poll here. How many of you have heard of Boudica? Okay, all right. I mean, I think that's almost unanimous consent in that. But I thought I'd ask you the question anyway, Duncan. Who was she?
Boudica was the wife of a British Iron Age king called Prasutagus. She wasn't the queen in her own right. There was a queen in the north of Britain who would have been in charge where we are now, called Cartimandua, at the same time, who was a queen in her own right, so women certainly could hold power. Boudica seems to have been the consort of this King Prasutagus in what is now East Anglia. And when the Romans invaded in AD 43, he becomes a client king of the Romans. It's much easier than fighting them. It's a lot safer than fighting them. You manage to remain unoccupied and remain in power in a nominal way. So she only really comes into the historical record when Prasutagus dies, and the Romans come in to seize the territory, and Boudica stands up to them. So that's where she comes into the story. That's where she enters historically.
Okay, so now what drew her to you?
It was interesting.
Or vice versa.
Well, hearing you say that you heard about Boudica at school and been fascinated ever since. We did Boudica at school in 1978, so I was 8 years old. It's the same age that kids mostly do it now, actually. And we did, she was Boudica then, of course, and we drew the pictures of her in her chariot. And we looked at the Ladybird Book of Roman Britain. And I suppose most of the other kids just forgot it, but I was mesmerised by the story, and I remained utterly mesmerised by it right through to becoming an archaeologist in my late teens. And it's a story I stuck with.
You thought it better than dinosaurs and what kids are into?
Much better, right, much better.
So, you call yourself an excavator?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, I as far as self-identification, I mean, yeah. I'm not sure what I would necessarily categorize myself, recovering goth, mod, but excavator.
I was very much a digging archaeologist. I excavated for several years before going to university, and then didn't do any postgraduate material, so I went straight out to become a digging archaeologist. So I spent the better part of 20 years excavating sites and latterly running a lot of sites and writing them up. So very much field-based, not an academic, as in, but yeah, I like getting my hands dirty.
And you've heard all of the Indiana Jones jokes and parallels and all of that stuff, right?
Lots of them.
Lots of them, all right. And I know we were talking earlier, you haven't seen the latest movie.
I haven't yet. I'm looking forward to it. It's had quite good reviews.
Okay. Do you have a favorite of the four so far?
The first one for me, that was the Indiana Jones of my childhood. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, the second one, Temple of Doom, was up there with Gandhi in accuracy about the Indian subcontinent. You use the title Echo Lands, The Journey in Search of Boudica. I mean, it's an incredibly atmospheric and evocative title.
Yes, I played with that. It evolved into Echo Lands. I played with echoes of rebellion for a while, but it was very much, I didn't want to tell just a normal standard history of Boudica. It's been done before very well. People have looked at the archaeology and the history and written standard historical texts. I wanted to go out and see what I could find of the landscape. And fundamentally, the landscape hasn't changed. You can go to a lot of the places where we know these events happened, either from the historical record, where it's very intimate. Places like Colchester, it's very intimate because Tacitus, who's the author who gives us the main story, gives us a very detailed account about these little places, names individual buildings where you can still go to the site of. Archaeology has teased out other stories. And so it was really about the act of travelling the landscape in the footprints of these participants as much as possible, and literally, that sort of the echo quality of that it's the landscape that's important in some ways. If you're standing in the middle of an empty field, it doesn't matter if something happened there yesterday or 2,000 years ago. It's just as irretrievably gone. It's the place that's important, and if you can stand in one particular location and know what happened and recreate it, then it's that sort of feel to it.
And Colchester has that feeling. I mean, I grew up in Colchester for about maybe 6 months.
Right.
At the age of 7, my dad had a locum there, and as a lot of places in East Anglia and that side of England and in Essex, you get the feeling even as a young child that something happened there. You may not know what, but something happened. I'm not talking about hauntings and anything like that, but it almost creates then that sense of curiosity, that allure, and it seems as though you feel this as well.
Yeah, this book, I cover in the preface, this book actually grew out of a visit to one of the Somme battlefields from the First World War in northern France. And that's a landscape I've been to a few times, and I think that has a very similar quality, that if you drove through it without knowing the history of the place, you'd still almost know that something had happened there. There's that enormity. And it was that sense that the landscape there hasn't changed. And I relate very briefly in the preface the origin of going out to search for Boudica in this particular way was I went to a particular battlefield on the Somme, the British called Beaumont Hamel, so I suppose Beaumont Hamel if you're in the French. And the British cinematographer at the time, Geoffrey Malins, recorded the build-up to the first day of the Battle of the Somme and then some of the events that took place during it. And the landscape hasn't changed. So I went back in 2014 with a portable DVD player and stood in the footprints. You can track down exact locations and hold up the screen horizon, line it up with the real horizon, and then watch these things happening. There was one particular spot where he filmed on this big mahogany and brass thing, waiting for a huge mine explosion to go up that he knew on his watch would go at a particular moment. That blows up, the whole hill goes up. Takes the film out, changes the film quickly, stays in the same position, pans the camera, and then watches the attack 10 minutes later coming across. And you can stand there and do the same thing. The landscape hasn't changed. And for want of a hackneyed phrase, it's a window. You're looking at this little black and white window and even seeing these tiny grayscale figures attacking across this hill slope and falling as the machine guns open up at 0 hour. So yes, it's that sense that history really is there.
You know, your description reminds me of the movie 1917, which the way that Sam Mendes shot it was as though it was just one long take.
Yes, beautiful shot.
It was really effective.
Beautiful.
And the other movie that your description reminds me of is, anyone ever see the movie Patton, 1970? There's a scene where, and this, by the way, is not blowing the plot of the movie, so don't worry, where Patton is in a jeep with General Omar Bradley. They're in Sicily, and Patton tells him, stop the jeep, and he gets out and he sees this, what seems to be insignificant field, and he says, this is where it happened, and he goes in to describe some war from the Peloponnesian era or wherever, and he says, I was there, because Patton used to believe in reincarnation, and Omar Bradley has a look on his face that says, I wish you were still there.
It's a beautiful scene. They have sort of war horns coming in the background as an echo
right,
sort of
thing.
Right.
That's right. You describe in 1919 the emergence of a man by the name of Rick Mortimer Wheeler. Who was he?
Rick Mortimer Wheeler in 1917 was a young artillery officer stationed in Colchester, but he was also a young archaeologist, and so he comes into the story. He was remarkably in 1917, amazing account he leaves in his memoirs. He's actually tunneling under one of these Roman gates in Colchester. They couldn't dig it all up, and it was part of it lies underneath a pub, famous pub called the Hole in the Wall. So an antiquarian who'd started tunnelling had died, so Wheeler turned up in Colchester during the war and thought, this is great. And he went through these tunnels, and they could hear the people in the pub above them and the fag ash and things coming through the floorboards into the tunnels, and they were digging by candlelight and then would go up and drink in the evening, which was how he tempted a lot of his excavators to join him in the first place. But he then goes off to the First World War, goes through the Battle of Passchendaele, absolutely terrible, described in his book, but comes back to Colchester after the war and crucially makes one of these great discoveries. He's taken down into the dungeons beneath Colchester Castle. They're always just assumed to be dungeons or cellars. Same date as the castle, they're Norman. And Wheeler, by candlelight, looked around and just said, dungeons be damned. This is a Roman temple. And it was the underside of the foundations of a Roman temple. And in that place, he knew it could only be the temple of Claudius, which is specifically mentioned by Tacitus in the story of Boudica's war.
Right. And so this then becomes really the first discovery for you to then begin your quest for Boudica?
Yeah, it's an incredibly important site. It's one of the few really rich details that Tacitus gives us. We have 3 accounts of Boudica's war. There's 2 from Tacitus and 1 from a much later writer called Cassius Dio. He's less reliable. It's not a great account. And Tacitus gives a short account which in the Agricola, which isn't very good, but in Book 14 of the Annals, he's writing proper history. And he describes Boudica's attack on Colchester, this completely undefended city, very populous city, inhabited by Roman veterans. So hard, handy men to have in a fight, but no longer soldiers. But the city was completely undefended, had no walls. What they did have was the Temple of Claudius, and this was on a high podium, about 4 meters high, with an enclosed temple on top, so a sort of a strong box on a fighting platform, and that would have been surrounded by some sort of wall at that time. It would later had a beautiful colonnaded walkway, but it would have been surrounded by something, this sacred precinct. So it gave them a bastion on which to anchor the defense. Tacitus tells us that as the city was sacked around them, they fell back on the temple, and it was stormed after a siege of 2 days. And looking at the archaeology, looking at his description, knowing what happened, when you go to Colchester Castle, you can go down and look at these foundations of this same temple, but crucially, the Norman castle was built on top. So the floor level of the castle, when you walk around it, you are walking through the Temple of Claudius on the same ground level. So if you could look back 2,000 years to that moment with all these poor souls trapped inside, you would be walking among them. They'd be standing around you. So it's those sorts of connections.
So Wheeler in 1917 is burrowing underneath, realizes this isn't the trench in the war, goes over to the war. There's not a coincidence that archaeology then seems to take off after a war. It seems as though, for some reason or the other, the opportunity, the impetus is there. I mean, is that a fair statement?
Yes. The First World War certainly influenced Wheeler's interpretation of later sites. He excavated a site called Maiden Castle, a big Iron Age hill fort in Dorset, and came across what he thought was a war cemetery there from it being stormed by the Romans, and he interpreted it very much in those terms. That's been reinterpreted, and question marks have been raised over that, but it certainly influenced Wheeler's interpretation, and he had a very military attitude to things. The Second World War obviously opened up a lot of, particularly in London, huge areas of land that could never have been looked at otherwise. And in one of the craters from the Blitz, they found the London Mithraeum, the Temple of Mithras in London, which you can go and visit now. It's an absolutely remarkable experience. I highly recommend it. But yes, war does kickstart these things. It's interesting looking at photographs from the beginning of the First World War and the end of the First World War, and they look like 2 different eras. So yeah, it really does shoot these things along, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I imagine in real time, you emerge from the underground in London and the Blitz has come through, the Luftwaffe has come through, and you see things, and I'm not sure if the first thing on their minds was, well, this war ends, I'm putting on a whip and a fedora. Okay, wrong movie. But going out and feeling the need to look at it. But I think about 3 years after Wheeler comes back and is in Colchester, and he finds the temple of Claudius. I mean, you got Howard Carter in Egypt finding Tutankhamun. So. It
was a remarkable era, the post-First World War era. I mean, Wheeler went on to become one of the most... he was a brilliant archaeologist. He was a hugely influential archaeologist. He was a complex person, quite a lot of people at the time didn't like him, and I think in retrospect, probably, I'm not sure I'd want to meet him. He was an interesting character, but his impact on archaeology was absolutely enormous. And I think those post-war years, I think it was the war that Wheeler thought that he had a mission to do all of this, because so many of his contemporaries who would have been doing it with him hadn't survived the war, and it was his thing to do.
So speaking of war, I mean, the Romans invade Britain. As you've described it, the imagery is, shall we call it, apocalyptic? I mean, how brutal was the Roman invasion?
The Roman invasion was apocalyptic. I think we have a rather sanitized view of the Roman conquest of Britain, or anywhere really, that it was a good thing. I don't think it was a good thing for many of the people at the time. Like most imperial conquest, it had a very unpleasant, brutal edge to it. It has been estimated that in the 40 years it took the legions to campaign from the southern coast up to the Highlands of Scotland, so AD 43 when they landed to AD 83 when they finally smashed the Caledonians at Mons Graupius. 40 years, about 30 years of which was active campaigning. About 250,000 Britons might have been killed outright. Now, we're plucking that figure out of the air in some ways, but the Roman army had no moral compunction not to kill everybody. And if you got them into a war they didn't want to be involved in, if you resisted beyond that first battle or two, if you rebelled, or if you involved them in a guerrilla war, and there was a prolonged guerrilla war in Wales in the AD 50s, just prior to Boudica's rebellion, they would commit genocide, and they were quite open about doing that. In the conquest of Wales in the AD 50s, the governor at the time said that the tribe of the Silures, who inhabited the whole of south and central Wales pretty much, should be eradicated from the face of the earth. Get rid of them. You know, they're resisting, kill the lot. And that was a very common thing. So yeah, it was apocalyptic. It was, you didn't go up against the Romans lightly, which is why initially one or two tribes fight them, they're beaten, and then lots of kings come forward and say, we'll make friends with you. You know, that's better than being occupied. But yeah, genuinely apocalyptic.
The way that you have the book set up is you weave in the past with the contemporary extremely well, and you also bring up evidence of trying to find someone from nearly 2,000 years ago. And you talk about in 1948 there was an excavation at Snettisham of coins. Any numismatists here? Coin collectors? Okay. Wow, this is interesting. Anyone stamps? Does anyone mail anything anymore? Okay. Wow, fascinating. Does anyone collect anything anymore other than Amazon boxes? Okay. Look, I'm a historian. I'm always on the meter, so this is all research for me. Coins as evidence. You talk about this, especially in the context of the excavations at Snettisham. I mean, it's almost as though a discovery changes the complexion of the search by providing more clues and more facts.
Yeah, well, Snettisham is a very famous site. If you go to the British Museum, there's a huge hoard of gold and silver torques, these enormous big neck rings that they used to wear in the Iron Age. More torques come from that one site than from the rest of Britain combined, and by quite a long way. So it was a remarkable site, and as you say, the first discovery was in 1948. And then a couple of years later, they found more. And then in 1991, the British Museum conducted excavations and found loads more. So it's very famous for these gold talks. But they did find a lot of coins as well. And there's one big hoard of coins there which seems to relate to the year of Boudica's war, which is fascinating in its own right, because the talks at Snettisham may well have been buried 150, 200 years before that. So it's a sacred space that's being utilised for a very long time. But one of the coins is, we call it a Norfolk wolf or an Iceni wolf coin. It's a gold coin about 20 millimeters in diameter, I suppose, and it's got a tiny little emaciated, spike-eared, beak-jawed wolf on it. It's been convincingly argued that this is very similar to a character in Norse mythology called Fenrir, a fen wolf. There's lots and lots in the coin going on that all relates to this one story about this fen wolf, which was a terrifying creature in Norse mythology, and it seems to be the same sort of figure, same sort of story. But remarkably, on this coin, the wolf seems to be standing on land littered with coins and talks, and underneath it, it seems there are talks and coins buried. So it's been speculated that this coin might actually be representing that site, which is absolutely amazing if it's true. We'll never know if it's true. But that's the way the coin's interpreted. And when you look at the imagery with that story in your mind, it's wonderful. So there are all these little narratives running through. And when you're talking about the Iron Age and the Roman conquest, there's so little in the historical record. The archaeology is magnificent, but interpreting it is always difficult. So when you can get these little snippets, it might just be a little portal into another part of the story. Yes, it's magical.
So some of those snippets you lend attention to in the book, and as a social historian, I'm always on the lookout for those things that people may not find to be that interesting because they may appear to be trivial or banal. And when the story of us is going to be written by people, it's going to be those little nuggets that aren't in the headlines that then add flavor and texture to who we were. A society of non-collectors of things, as an example. It's never too late, folks. It's never too late. But you described the harvest, and I was fascinated by it because it reminded me that these people actually had things to occupy their day-to-day existence.
They were farmers. Yeah, they were a farming society. And what was interesting is that the Romans invaded in AD 43. We have this, for Boudica's tribe, the Iceni, we have this period of the client kingdom where they're effectively left to get on with things, but they are disarmed. And that's very important. It was just AD 47, so just a few years after the conquest, they actually rebelled. The small rebellion, because they were disarmed. The Romans said, you've no need for swords anymore, you've no need for war spears, we're taking them, and there was a fight for them. So by the time of Boudica's war in AD 60, 17 years after the conquest, they're not even being raised as warriors anymore. They're completely disarmed, they haven't been raised as warriors. They're farmers, and they always have been. Even in a time when they were warriors, they were a citizen militia. First and foremost, they were farmers. Subsistence farmers, and of course war then as war now, as we can see what's going on in Ukraine, it has a catastrophic effect on the agricultural system. Tacitus specifically mentions at the end of Boudica's war the worst affliction was famine, and that's not difficult to believe. He ascribes it to the Britons not having planted their crops because they were going to war. I don't believe that for a minute. They were farmers. They would always have planted their crops. I think the famine probably came from the Romans crop burning and harvesting the crops on their own account, and the fact that they'd been so depopulated in this terrible war, there was just not enough people to gather in that harvest. But they were farmers. And I think famine would have been the ubiquitous end to every campaigning season.
Yeah, and I think it's so important to then point out that what was the cause of it, instead of just saying, well, famine just happened, as though famines come about serendipitously without looking at the fact that what were the underlying events that led up to that. So Boudica enters your narrative, and alongside that, the treatment that she receives by the Romans. So if you'll permit me, the queen had been tied up as a recalcitrant slave and beaten like one. She would have lost the flesh from her back, and I apologize if this is graphic, and was probably half killed by the ordeal. Roman centurions administered justice with their staff of office, a vine stick, a serious beating that could inflict internal injuries as well as laceration of the skin and muscle. Beaten or whipped, she would doubtless have been unconscious by the end, her tormentors little caring whether she still breathed or not. This is a queen, and yet the Romans had a disregard of treating her as though she was, as you said, nothing more than a recalcitrant slave.
She was a queen. She was probably a Roman citizen as well. And I think this is, I believe that this comes from Tacitus, from his classic account in the Annals. He tells us that Boudica was flogged, her daughters were raped, and the Romans began to dispossess the people. What seems to have happened is that at the end of the clientship, when Prasutagus dies, everything's forfeit. Now, Prasutagus tried to ward that off by leaving a will to the Emperor Nero, in which he left half of his kingdom to Nero and the other half to his two daughters with Boudica. So at that moment, Boudica's not the important person. It's the daughters. They're the embodiment of the future of the tribe. And Boudica, presumably, he doesn't go into any details, Boudica presumably stands up to the Romans as the default leader at that moment of the Iceni, and says, you're not coming in, you're not having everything, this is not what the king wanted. That effectively makes her a rebel. So whether she's a queen or a Roman citizen, to the Romans, the clientship was at an end. The brutality of it, it's difficult to get your head around what the Romans thought they were trying to achieve in that act, I think is what I'm trying to say, I suppose. I suppose that they, as with when the Iceni were disarmed in 47, they hoped that would be the end of it. It actually caused a rebellion. I think, that, again, this is it. The Romans are saying, you're not important anymore. The land is Nero's, the wealth is Nero's, you are unimportant. So I think it was a grossly misjudged act by any standard. It was an atrocity even by Roman standards. As I say, she was a Roman citizen, so this should never have been allowed to happen.
You have a description in the book that really struck me, and it's caused me to look down a lot more as I'm walking the streets of Bradford. You said that land is only a few inches beneath your feet, the land of this history. And to think about that we're treading on that same ground, but also the fact that beneath, there's what lies beneath is so critical. And so you followed in the footsteps of Wheeler and ostensibly Boudica and the Romans in Colchester. And this is what you write. You say, if anything, Culver Square seems even more bereft of its past than Lion Walk. The fortress buildings lay in parallel rows running directly across the square beneath Debenhams, H&M, and HMV. The converted centurions' quarters of 8060 beneath the square itself, but they too are long gone now, along with the souls who once inhabited them. I wander into a few shops in search of a lower ground floor that would at least take me down to the physical level of the Roman city in vain. I don't think I'll ever go to a -1 level in a store again without thinking about this, because it's very true. So I'm going to ask a question. Do any of you, and I'm not judging by where you shop, but do any of you go to these stores and think, I'm descending into the history of this place? You just go there because that's where the sale items are. Okay. Duly noted as well. But this idea though that you describe throughout the book, you give us markers of what we see every day and with which we interact every day. But you've got thousands of years of history just below that patina of tile.
And the magic is where you can identify exact locations, and that's what the whole book is trying to do, is to recreate that sense of connection that I had on the Somme looking at footage, is to try and find places. And although the history can be quite vague sometimes, there are some phenomenal examples from the history. The archaeology is teased out lots as well. One magical moment is to go. It's a bit further afield, but it's standing on the shore of the Menai Strait. Boudica's war, the Tacitus's account of Boudica war, begins actually with the invasion of Anglesey. The Roman army is a long way away, which is why she's able to do it. They're in North Wales. And he gives this fantastic, thrilling account of the crossing of the Menai Strait to Anglesey on the far shore. It's not wide there, it's a few hundred meters wide, but they've created a fleet of flat-bottomed landing crafts to get across there. And he describes the scene on the opposing shore of the Druids hurling curses at the Roman troops, and priestesses or druidesses with disheveled hair like furies, he says, brandishing torches, and this huge army. Beautiful. You can stand there and read Tacitus and just gaze across and see what he was seeing. It's stunning. But when it comes to places like Colchester, particularly, and London particularly, there's a wonderful. I mentioned a Marks and Spencer's in London on Fenchurch Street. Do you know that closed the week before the book was published? So you can't replicate that at the moment, but when it does reopen, you'll be able to go into whatever replaces it and do the same thing. But I didn't know, at the time, but the food court, Marks and Spencer's food hall, was on the lower ground floor. And it lies over what in AD 60, when Boudica attacked the city, was a gravelled marketplace. And you get onto the escalator and you descend. Now, all this was playing through my head because I knew the archaeology very well, and I'd do all of the maps and plans, and I tried to get everything to within a metre or two. And as I descended down the escalator, I knew I was going down into a building which had been burnt during Boudica's attack, that they'd found thick grain deposits that had been a grain store. So you get off the escalator in this Roman building which was destroyed. You're just in a clothes department in that bit. And you turn around and go into the food hall, and you're walking on the exact same level as this marketplace that was there in Boudica's time. And it's still a market. It's identifying moments like that. In London's great for it because you can go down into tube stations and walk through whole streets that were destroyed during Boudica's attack. And yeah, it's identifying exact places and moments in time.
So that location at Marks and Spencer's, I mean, they couldn't repel the Romans back in the day, but they saw you coming and they closed up.
Almost immediately.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. You literally toiled in your quest for Boudica, and in fact sustained some injuries, including I think your legs.
A shin splint.
It was a shin splint. Well. You decided to actually wear Roman sandals to do this.
I did. Yes.
All right. Mistake number one?
No, they're very comfortable. They're great.
Okay.
So
I mean, but they're no Skechers.
They're not. They're more comfy than my walking boots, I have to say. I'm not a reenactor. Okay. I'm not a living historian, but I do have I love reenactment stuff. I love living history encampments, so I can't resist buying the stuff. So I do have a Roman legionary mannequin completely kitted out in marching order, including his hobnailed Caligile marching boots. So I recreated the March of the Ninth Legion. Now, the Ninth Legion is very famous. I'm sure a lot of people will be familiar with a beautiful book written by Rosemary Sutcliffe called The Eagle of the Ninth, where that legion disappears, and it's still a great mystery as to what happened to it. But that's set much later. That's set much later in the probably 60 years after Boudica's war. It was an unlucky legion. In Boudica's war, it was the closest legion to Colchester in the southeast. It was the garrison covering that part of the country. The rest of the army was in Wales. So when the war broke out, a big detachment of the 9th Legion immediately marches for Colchester to try and relieve the city. Exactly where they were based at that time has been a point of argument. It was almost certainly just near Peterborough. There's a place called Longthorpe where the fortress has been partially excavated. And if they were there and they were marching to Colchester, it was about 75 miles, and you can follow the Roman roads, and it was a pretty good exact route. You can follow it. We can be almost certain, as certain as you can be, that that's the route they would have taken. So what we don't know, is what happened to them. Tacitus tells us that they were wiped out on the way. They didn't get to Colchester. They were massacred, at least the infantry contingent. So probably about 2,000 men. This was a huge disaster. We've no idea where it happened. So I wanted to follow that route. So the first bit from Peterborough to Cambridge I drove. It's motorway. It would have been very difficult to walk, but it was almost certainly not up there that it happened. But from Cambridge to Colchester, I walked the rest of the route to try and identify from a military perspective where a good place to ambush them would have been. And I identified an area where I think there was a perfect storm, really, for the Britons to have taken them on. But there's a beautiful preserved stretch of Roman road. It goes from Cambridge all the way to Haverhill in Suffolk, so I don't know, 15 miles or something. And it's the original Roman road. So I wore my Roman army marching boots on that stretch so they could crunch on the original Roman gravel of the road. Exactly the same gravel that the 9th Legion marched along. Who wouldn't have done that? But it was a long walk, and I wasn't prepared for it, and I got a shin splint. So by the end of the day's walking, I was hobbling, absolutely hobbling. Yes, it was very painful.
All better now?
It's all better.
All right, excellent. So you follow this path, Cambridge, Colchester, Peterborough, and then we were talking about Londinium. We've got London, and not necessarily the marks and sparks there, but Boudica then makes an appearance for you.
In the sense of,
does she take on the Romans in London?
Yeah, well, yes. So once she's destroyed Colchester, London's the next victim. It's completely, again, undefended. There's no garrison anymore. They've wiped out the 9th Legion. They've destroyed Colchester. London is sitting 50 or so miles away as the next target. So they march. What's interesting is that the Roman governor, Suetonius Paulinus, from Anglesey, I think I was 270 odd miles to cover, he gets to London before Boudica. So the timing of that has caused so many arguments and discussions, it's almost worth not going down that road because we don't know what happened. He gets there before Boudica. She could have been delayed for so many reasons. But having got there, he declares the city completely indefensible. It's a huge, sprawling, mercantile boom town. It's often likened to a boom town of the Wild West. It's that sort of character of settlement. It's indefensible. So he then abandons it. And as he abandons it, Boudica comes in, and yes, the same sorry story as in Colchester. Whoever hasn't evacuated is massacred. And as in Colchester beneath London, 5-6 meters below London, it's a long way down, there's this thick layer of burning, the Boudican destruction horizon, or the red layer. It's red because the houses were built mostly of daub and mud brick, and when they're burnt, they turn into a sort of friable orange ceramic. So you get this thick layer of broken daub and ash and scorched clay, and it's all still down there.
So there could be a lot more evidence of Boudica beneath London right now.
Yeah.
So then what is our responsibility to preserve this kind of archaeology? I mean, we have the New Elizabeth line, which has air conditioning, lovely in the summer. London is still a sprawling city by most measure, and yet it is a city that, in order to adapt to both its increasing population and the dynamism, and as we ostensibly progress as a society, there's going to be this impulse to dig. Should we dig? How carefully should we dig if we do? What do we owe Boudica and others like her when it comes to the excavations and the potential of overlooking or even destroying something?
Well, since 1990, archaeology has been very much tied into the planning process. So it's very difficult for anybody to develop anything, to dig below ground on a development, to quarry, to build roads or anything else without an archaeological input. So those two have evolved together in the last few decades. It's really the only archaeology that I've known, because I became an archaeologist. I started digging in 1990, so when all this was coming in. I think by and large it works very well, and there's always an argument for preserving exceptional things in situ. I think in Colchester, things still get excavated when necessary, but I think by and large they often try and avoid going down to those levels if they can. Obviously, for the developer, there's a cost to it because you do then need to dig it. In London, I think it's just the case they do what they have to do, but there's a lot of fantastic archaeological units now, and all of this work is always covered and very well excavated nowadays. It's rare for things to be preserved in situ, although in London, when they do uncover things that are particularly interesting, like the amphitheatre, they tend to preserve them in situ and then build up around them. So you then still go down and visit them underneath the Guildhall in London. You can go and see it. So it's, that's very,
That's one of the reasons, if any of you have been to Rome, there's only 2 metro lines, the blue and the red, and I think the fear of digging into something else is probably quite great. So now you go from London, you go to Verulamium, or St. Albans, and do you find Boudica there?
You do, less so. So when the Roman, Suetonius Paulinus, the Roman general, withdraws from London, there's a lot of argument about where he may have withdrawn to. I think the inference is that he draws north, back through Verulamium, which is modern St. Albans, or next to modern St. Albans. What he does say is that wherever Paulinus went, Boudica went there. She went straight up Watling Street, and Verulamium was the next and supposedly the last victim. Verulamium Park, which is a beautiful, enormous area of parkland next to St. Albans, is the site of the Roman town, and it is mostly undeveloped. It is still park. There's been a lot of excavation there. Some of it has gone down onto Boudica's layers, but Verulamium at that time was very small, so a lot of the excavations carried out by Wheeler, again, he's always a part of the story, were outside of that area. But yes, you get that same level of burning and that same destruction. But I think by the time you get to Verulamium, I think it would have been utterly deserted. I don't think anybody in their right mind would have hoped that by this time the city wasn't going to be destroyed and everybody massacred. So I think it was a deserted city. What happens after Verulamium is the big question, because that's the last place that Tacitus gives us. He takes us from Norfolk with the Iceni going down to Colchester, then to London, up to Verulamium. That's it then. He just tells us that the Romans broke off delay and fought a battle. Yeah, the last historical sighting. So the Tacitus mentions the Iceni destroying Verulamium, and that's the last place name that he mentions.
Yeah, I was struck. So much of modern literature and reading these narratives is that you're looking for a resolution, you're looking for a conclusion, but here you still leave it open-ended. Actually, I found that to be strangely satisfactory. It's nice to not know where she is. Could be in a parking lot next to Richard III, but that's a whole different story. What do you admire about Boudica? What should we admire about Boudica? I mean, after all, she's got this wonderful sculpture devoted to her and her daughters at Parliament Square.
Sculpture. Yes, love that sculpture. You've got to love a rebel. I mean, you've got to. And I think the circumstances in which Boudica was such an impossible situation. She couldn't not fight back after what had happened. And I think the interesting thing is we have all this evidence for Boudica's war, and the evidence of that is very stark in the soil. It's everywhere you look for it in these places. There's no doubt that it happened. We have a fantastic historical account telling us about all these massacres and these towns being destroyed in this great final battle. None of these authors tell us anything about Boudica particularly. Dio does, but it's all made up. But sadly, the great description of the flowing red hair and the multicolored tunic and that, it's made up. It's not a real description of Boudica. So that has enabled every successive generation and every movement, I suppose, to mythologize her in their own way. I think the most important group to have latched on to Boudica were the suffragettes. And there's a great synchronicity going on there, that Thornycroft's statue on the landfall of Westminster Bridge, of this amazing group of this warrior woman, this scythe chariot, and her daughters at her side and spear raised. It's placed so that it's facing the Houses of Parliament. It looks like she's storming Parliament. It's brilliant. The suffragettes immediately saw that. And it went up at the same time that the militant wing of the suffragettes was just starting. So there was a full-size plaster cast of that statue up from about 1898, but it was officially unveiled in bronze in 1902. And that was just when Emmeline Pankhurst was bringing in the Women's Social and Political Union, and the militant wing was starting. So by 1906, the WSPU and the other suffrage movements were using that statue as a rallying point. And in 1908, the Women's Social and Political Union produced a beautiful silver brooch of the statue, which was based on a photo. I found the photograph it was based on. It was a photograph taken by Thomas Thornycroft's son just before the statue was unveiled. They're incredibly rare, these brooches, but you look at portrait photographs of the suffragettes: Christabel Pankhurst, Emmeline Pankhurst, Elsie Howie, Mary Phillips, Mary Braithwaite. There's fantastic portrait photographs of these suffragettes wearing this Boudica brooch. And I think that's fantastic. They're incredibly rare. I have to confess, I've managed to track down 2 of them over the years, so I have 2. They're my most treasured possessions. They're beautiful, wonderful things. But yeah, I think Boudica will always be an eternally important figure for that reason. She stands for that kickback, doesn't she, against anything that's oppressive. And for the suffragettes, particularly, I suppose, targeted male violence. She was beaten half to death by men, and her daughters were raped. You couldn't have a more targeted male attack. So,
you should probably bury them in Snettisham. And, maybe in a few hundred years, somebody will find them and say, what was this? And write a book about it.
I'm not leaving my house.
Fair enough. So the book is The Journey in Search of Boudica. You didn't find her physically, but did you still find her?
I was able to look at landscapes that she must have known. I was able to stand there very much as with the portable DVD player and look at landscapes that apart from superficially haven't changed. And they're landscapes she must have known intimately, places in Norfolk particularly where you have these remarkable archaeological sites that we know were occupied and important at her time, particularly places like Thetford, which is a remarkable landscape. Some people don't generally think of Thetford being a remarkable landscape now, although people talk about Thetford Forest. But in the Iron Age, it was a hugely important site, and it was probably very, very important to Boudica and Prasutagus during the era of the client kingship. I believe that is where the army gathered to march to Colchester. So, and in following in all of those footsteps, trying to follow as closely as possible these campaign routes, I think I don't know how closely you find the people, but you're able to look through the landscapes, as I say in the book, nicking an M.R. James quote, through dead men's eyes, if you like. And this was a story I knew well. It's a story I've been obsessed with my whole life. But doing this took it to a completely new level for me, a state of understanding and perhaps getting into the minds of the participants a bit more. Yeah.
We have time for questions. We have a roving mic. Take a lady in the middle and then the gentleman here in the blue.
That's been really fascinating. Thank you. I was just wondering, obviously Boudica's been sort of used as a feminist icon and reclaimed, as you touched on, her action against male violence and retribution, her rebellion as a sort of figure of an underestimated woman. I'm very excited to hear about the suffragette brooches. Didn't know about that. Jealous you've got 2. And you say people don't collect things.
No, I said you people don't collect things. He's fine.
I was just wondering if you think that there's any element to which she's been sort of held up as a feminist pinup that isn't accurate or isn't a fair reflection of her, other than the redhead pinup, which I'm very disappointed about.
So any part of it that's unfair or unreasonable? Yeah, that's a good question. Not by the feminist movement, I don't think. I mean, the suffragettes particularly went for warrior women as icons. They were very big on Joan of Arc as well. I think certainly others have twisted it horribly. The Thornycroft statue on the Thames has emblazoned on it, "Regent Caesar never knew, thy posterity shall sway," which is from a Cowper poem, which was really a clarion call to the destiny of the British Empire. That, the Romans are having their day now, but we'll have our day in the end. That was the most perverse twisting of the legend I think you could have. You had a rebel against an imperial power, a native rebel, then being twisted by an imperial power to be an imperial icon. It was classic Victorians, who are very good at that sort of thing. But she was a troublesome figure for the Victorians, hugely troublesome. At the time when Thornycroft started, I think the same year that Thornycroft actually started the group, you had the British Army fighting the rebellion in India in 1857. Where you also had a strong female leader there, the Rani of Jhansi, fighting the British. So she was hugely problematic for the Victorians, and they coped with that by twisting her into their own imperial icon and a patriotic figure. I think that the feminist appropriation of Boudica has always been very appropriate, actually, and very well done. I don't think the suffragettes actually didn't overplay it. They were actually seemed to have been more keen on Joan of Arc, but Boudica was that obvious figure. But no, I think for the feminist and suffrage movements, I don't think she was misappropriated or misshown. Actually, others did it. The Victorians and the government and whoever else did it. But sorry, does that answer? Does it? Okay.
Right. Gentleman here in the light blue polo.
Hi. 2 questions. First of all, why did Boudica not join forces with Cartiman-Due? And secondly, the Roman historians didn't really speak well of British women leaders. They're either whores or crazy women. Do you think the historians were sort of gagged, and she may have well gone on beyond Colchester and done more, but the Romans didn't want it publicised?
It's very interesting. I don't think she'd have joined forces with Cartimandua if there'd been a more extensive uprising. It would have been with the anti-Roman factions of the Brigantes. So up here, this is the territory of the Brigantes. You had Cartimandua, who was quite a loyal client of the Romans. So when the great British rebel leader Caratacus was captured in AD 51, he fled north into this sort of area. Cartimandua seized him and handed him over, and I can't blame her for doing that. Again, she didn't want to have to fight the Romans. Her husband, Venutius, was very anti-Roman, and so when they split up, he led the anti-Roman faction. Eventually, Cartimandua had to be rescued by the Romans, and then they had to fight their way through the north, fighting the anti-Roman faction. So it wouldn't have been Cartimandua. I think she and Boudica were, I was about to say, they were of different molds. They weren't necessarily until AD 60. Boudica, of course, had also been a client, but I don't think Cartimandua would have been up for that. I don't think the Roman historians were gagged in any way. There have been other destruction layers found, particularly west of London, so say Winchester, Silchester, which was the big Iron Age centre at Caleva, Atrebatum. They do have destruction layers there. Others have suggested that therefore Boudica and the Romans retreated west from London, and Boudica followed them, burning these settlements en route. doesn't match my reading of the text. I wouldn't say they're not related. It could be local insurgents fired on by this or whatever, but I don't think Tacitus or Dio felt any compunction to be gagged about it at all, and both of them are actually very critical of the Romans and critical of Nero, and they're writing at a time when they can get away with saying whatever they want. Tacitus is writing the annals in about 120, so about 60 years after the event, and of course his father-in-law Agricola was in the campaign. I think he's writing good history. I think he's telling us it pretty much as he understood it. There's 3 tiers of evidence in Tacitus. There's the good campaign narrative, where it was destroyed, there's a battle, etc. Very good. The second tier of evidence is when he's talking about Boudica and her daughters and individuals, where I think he's pulling the strings and trying to get you either on side or off side, depending who he's talking about. Cartimandua, very interestingly, the Romans didn't like her. They don't portray her positively, despite the fact that she was loyal to them. Boudica, they have an admiration, I think, for the fact that she kicked back against what was clearly very bad administration at the time. They seem to have more respect for her. But no, I think Tacitus is giving us fairly as it is. Yeah.
Okay. We have time for another question. Yes, sir.
I don't think he'd tell us where the final battle is. And if you ever find it, what would you expect to be there archaeologically?
That's a great question.
Thank you.
I like that. Because that is something I do cover at the end of the book. So people have looked for this battle from North Wales to Warwickshire, to the West Country, to Cambridgeshire, London, all over the place. And it's based on a very vague description that Tacitus gives of the geography of the battlefield. So he simply says that the Romans were defending some sort of defile, valley, narrowing landscape feature. The Britons approached from clear ground, and the Romans had forest behind them, so they couldn't be outflanked. That's it. Open an ordnance survey map, you're going to find dozens of sites like that, and that's the problem. People prospect for this battlefield by saying, "Cool, now that would work." There's loads of places that work, hundreds of them. I think crucially, what I talk about at the end of the book is that Tacitus's account is slightly confused because he talks about the fall of Verulamium, and then he puts in a paragraph about the conduct of the Britons, how they don't take prisoners, they avoid stiff fights for plunder, all this sort of thing. And then he gets back to what's going on and says that the Romans broke off delay and fought a battle. That bit about the Britons is a parenthesis. It could have gone in anywhere. But it breaks in the narrative the fall of Verulamium and the Romans breaking off delay and fighting a battle. Paulinus, I don't believe, was running scared. He had an army of 10,000 men. It was no mean Roman army. The entire southwest of Britain, which was the hardest fought bit of the Roman conquest, was fought with an army that size. I don't think he was running scared. He'd lost the province. He'd been torn away from Wales at the moment of his absolute victory. He needed to stamp this out. He wasn't running scared. So I think he fell back from London to Verulamium, and then he fought a battle. So I think you need to be looking very close to that area. I think he effectively is telling us the area that it's near Verulamium, and remarkably, archaeologically, there's a site on the hills just about a mile southwest of Verulamium where first century battle artifacts, hundreds of them, have come to light. And when you go up there and look at the landscape, that position on a hilltop is backed by ancient woodland and is approached from Watling Street, which was Boudica's routeway, through a defile. So I make a case for the battle being very close to St Albans. It is established as a first century battle site now, so there's no doubt a scrap took place there, and I think the landscape works. That's not to say it is. There's nothing definitive. The only definitive way we're ever going to discover it would be a funerary monument for the 400 Roman dead. That may remain to be found. The Roman dead, supposedly 400 of them, would have been buried on or near the battlefield, and they would have had a funerary monument. Whether or not that will ever found or exist, that will be how we definitively locate it. But I think this site next to St Albans has a very good case to be made for it.
And most of these artifacts are at the British Museum?
They're not. Those are in the local museum in Verulamium,
Okay.
actually, Verulamium Museum.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, I mean, you can't have them at the British Museum because most of those things are from somewhere else. So, Echolands, A Journey in Search of Boudica. Duncan McKay, thank you so much for the book. Thank you so much for the conversation. Please thank him.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the festival, please subscribe, share this episode with others, and leave a rating. Don't forget to mark your calendars as the Bradford Literature Festival returns for its 10th year from 28th of June to the 7th of July 2024.